we're straight up 7 o'clock, and that's when we want to get this started. If we could go ahead and get Madeline to get her slides up and going. The format will be that we're going to ask the presenters to do their presentation, kind of short and sweet, hit the major bullet points. And then as we go through the program, at the end of the program, we will have plenty of time for a Q&A, question and answer situations. So our first speaker is Madeline Westenberg. She's an agricultural climatologist with Iowa State University. She's helping us understand what's going on in climate and weather. And if I say more than that, I probably say more than I really know. So Madeline, the podium is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about weather and climate, and I'll just get right into it. And of course, now it doesn't work to advance my slides. Let's see here. There we go. All right. So we're going to do about a week out weather reports. We've got some changing weather coming here in Iowa tonight, in fact. So we'll hit that quick. We'll also talk about the El Nino Southern Oscillation, what that is and what that means for us here in the Midwest. And then we'll take a look at what our current El Nino Southern Oscillation outlook is from the Climate Prediction Center. And then we'll take a look at the Climate Prediction Center winter outlooks. So try to keep it nice and short and sweet. So we do have a cold front moving through tonight. This is bringing some cold temperatures down from Canada into the Midwest tonight. So it looks like highs in the teens for the next 2 days. So in Iowa, bundle up, check on your cattle, and just be mindful that that's what we've got coming up in the next few days. We also have chances for scattered snow across the state. So keep in mind that any precipitation that's liquid may freeze as temperatures drop. So watch out for ice and ice hidden underneath snow especially. All right, so the El Nino Southern Oscillation, this is we call it a global teleconnection. So it's a phenomena that exists on Earth where the sea surface or ocean temperatures are working together with the atmosphere. And that relationship between those sea surface temperatures and atmospheric circulations actually influence our local weather here in North America. And we can talk more specifically about those effects within Iowa. So during the 1960s, scientists discovered or really connected these two observations between changing sea surface temperatures along the equator off the coast of South America and how that was influencing weather in North America. It is a naturally occurring phenomena. El Nino is the name of the warm phase, and this is occurring when sea surface temperatures are above average, and there's also a presence of weak trade winds. And La Nina is what was coined the cool phase. So this is when the trade winds are stronger, there's a below normal sea surface temperatures, and that just changes our atmospheric setups of low and high pressures. So yeah, these changes in sea surface temperatures really affect the distribution of atmospheric patterns and circulation features. So this changes the intensity and position of jet streams, and that's really what drives these changes in our local weather phenomena. So we call this a coupling when the sea surface temperatures and atmosphere are working together. So this top figure here, I wonder if I can annotate. So this top figure here where we're talking about El Nino, this shows this area of warm water along the equator off the coast of South America, and that warm water causes upward motion. And that upward motion will create clouds, and that will influence weather patterns in North America. So kind of a shift of that happens during La Nina phase, when there's this area of cold or below normal temperature in that same region, and that allows for downward motion of the atmosphere, causing this upward motion to occur toward the east. And so again, that changes our circulation patterns. And I apologize, these figures are unfortunately flipped. So in this case, La Nina is this example, and El Nino is this example here. But that really shows you where that area of low pressure exists in the El Nino, and that causes that Pacific jet stream to set up further south, and allows for warmer and drier conditions here in the Midwest. On the other hand, La Nina has this blocking high pressure system, which causes the polar jet stream to set up more north, and that allows for that cold polar air to be pulled down into North America, and that causes oftentimes colder and wetter conditions here in Iowa in winters. So this phenomena is oftentimes stronger in winter than it is in summer. But also the strength of the ENSO event, meaning how far from normal temperatures are in the ocean, can determine how strong these links are connected and how well that ENSO can be used as a predictor for weather in Iowa. So we'll take a look here. Oh, great heavens. I wonder if I can get rid of the annotating. Clear all drawings. There we go. Perfect. So right now from the CPC, our ENSO alert system status is a La Nina watch, meaning right now we're in ENSO neutral conditions. So the sea surface temperatures in that region I showed are within plus or minus 0.5 degrees Celsius of normal. So right now we're in ENSO neutral conditions, but are expected to transition into a La Nina this winter. And this plot here just shows blue is the probability of La Nina, and it shows here that we're expected with a 71% chance in December, January, and February for that La Nina to develop, but looking like a fairly short-lived La Nina as we head into spring and summer of ENSO neutral conditions ramping back up again. All right, so we'll take a look at the outlooks here. This is the 6 to 10 day temperature and precipitation outlook. And so these are valid for December 14 through 18. So on average, we're looking at warmer than normal temperatures with about a, what is that, 50 to 60% chance. So that's the probability of leaning above. That doesn't mean that temperatures are going to be 50 to 60% warmer. It just means there's a stronger probability of above average temperatures in this region. So if we take a look at Texas and other friends in the southern region and Southwest, they have 60 to 70% likelihood of temperatures being above normal. Again, not 60 to 70% warmer temperatures, but a greater chance of and stronger confidence of those temperatures being above normal. Then if we take a look at our 6 to 10 day precipitation outlook, that shows a 33 to 40% chance of above average precipitation in Iowa for the next 6 to 10 days. This is unsurprising as we look out at the end of the week forecast and out a little bit beyond that. Again, I wouldn't trust any forecasts beyond about 7 to 10 days. And the sooner the forecast is valid for, often the higher confidence we can have in it. But we do have chances for precipitation in the next 7 days. So it's unsurprising that the 6 to 10 day precip outlook does show slightly leaning above. Then we'll take a look at the 8 to 14 day outlooks. So these are valid for December 16th through the 22nd. And it's looking like for Iowa, we have again about 50 to 60% chance of above normal temperatures. So again, like I talked about at the very beginning, we do have a cold front moving through. And so unfortunately, we're not going to feel those warm temperatures in the next 2 days, right? It's going to be very cold with that cold air coming down from Canada in the next 2 days. But this is looking on average within this time frame, a likelihood of temperatures being above average. And then if we take a look at the precipitation outlook, 8 to 14 days, they're expecting a few drier days between this December 16th and 22nd time frame.
We need to wrap up.
Okay, I believe this is my last slide.
Okay.
So, nothing exciting for the end of December into January. Equal chances in Iowa for above, below, or normal precipitation and temperature, and this is fairly La Nina-esque when we look at precipitation. All right. There's similar information for December through February, and I'm finished. Thank you.
Very good. And we will make sure that everyone has the URL so they know where to go to find this information on your website, Madeline.
Perfect.
If you will go ahead and log out, we'll ask Amber to go ahead and share her screen.
Yep, here we go. Can you see what I'm seeing?
Yep, sure can. There you go. Amber Fredrickson is the hay and forage grower, new editor, and she's going to give us an overview of growing conditions, harvest conditions, and maybe some forage test information so far this year.
Yep, that's right. Thank you, Fred, and thanks for having me on this panel of experts. I just want to throw a disclaimer out there. I'm by no means an expert in alfalfa production, but I'm more of a gatherer of information. So I've just gathered some information here today on the growing conditions and harvest conditions and some of the forage quality trends that we're kind of seeing when we look back in the rearview mirror of 2024. And this picture here kind of paints a good image of what we saw at the front half of the growing season. I don't want to be living in the past, but I think the first cutting, kind of that late spring, early summer time period, was a pretty significant factor when we look back on the harvest season in total, because it was just a really wet period. It really pushed harvest schedules back, delayed first cuttings, and that really delayed subsequent cuttings. This picture here was taken about mid-June on a dairy farm in southeast Minnesota, and they had about a 2 to 3 day window where there wasn't a cloud in the forecast and there wasn't any rain scheduled, so they decided to cut their losses and get their alfalfa cut with the trade-off of quite a bit of field damage because soil didn't have the chance to dry out at all. So I think that's a pretty common story that producers are telling when they look back on first cutting, second cutting conditions. They kind of just had to bite the bullet and maybe suffer the consequences of some wet soil conditions and some subsequent field damage there. So here's another picture just from that same kind of time period, early June. This is also taken in central Minnesota area. I don't know if it's very obvious in this picture, but the alfalfa was pretty well over mature. I don't see any purple flowers, but there were some, it was well in the bloom stage when we were on that farm. And lodging was a pretty significant issue in those over mature stands, which just made for difficult harvesting conditions for those first couple cuttings. And if you squint to see that back tractor tire, there's quite a bit of mud caked in there. So another instance of just wet harvest conditions and just kind of a messy start to the growing season. And I just have a couple of maps here. Let me see. I think maybe I'll shorten this panel. just showing the average temperature and average precipitation for that maybe June through August period. Especially looking at the map on the right here, you can see that average precipitation for Northwest Iowa, Southeast South Dakota, and Southwest Minnesota was especially above average. And that just kind of gives you a visual for what I was talking about, those first cutting growing conditions and harvest conditions. But switching gears here, sorry, let me get to my next slide. If we look at the same maps from August through October, it kind of seems like we went from one extreme to the next in terms of alfalfa growing and harvest conditions. It got a lot hotter from October through or August through October with that same viewing area, just much above average temperatures. And if we look at the precipitation maps here, it got a lot drier. So really kind of flipped the narrative there in terms of Northwest Iowa, Southeast South Dakota, and Southwest Minnesota, just well below average rainfall there. And I also decided to just throw in one of the most recent U.S. drought monitor maps to put that low precipitation into perspective. That same area of the Midwest that we're talking about, most of it's seeing moderate drought levels, if not abnormally dry. And I just kind of chuckled because if you think back to that farm on the first slide, the super wet harvest conditions and the super wet first cutting, and if you asked that guy what he thought the rest of the harvest season would hold, I don't think he would have said drought. So just kind of the tale of two different halves of the growing season in terms of forage harvest and alfalfa harvest. With that said, here's a little bit of data that I grabbed from Rock River Labs in Watertown, Wisconsin. John Gazer's the director there. He's a great resource when it comes to talking forage quality. And this is by no means all encompassing when it comes to forage samples, but this data comes from alfalfa from the Midwest, so it's an average of all the Midwestern states, but pretty relevant to what we're talking about here. So if you look at the first graph on the top, it's neutral detergent fiber levels of alfalfa hay and haylage. Compared to last year, we're sitting at a pretty heavy bell curve on the higher end of that spectrum of NDF and alfalfa hay, higher fiber, higher structural fiber, and that's probably just because harvest schedules and cutting dates got pushed back so far, and kind of hitting those more over mature stages of alfalfa when farmers wanted to get in the field and just couldn't get that done on time. And then the opposite's kind of true for the total digestible nutrients in the graph on the bottom here. Looking at the two bell curves between last year and this year, forage sample data, you can kind of see it's maybe a wider spread for 2024, but quite a bit more data on that lower end of the energy spectrum. So looking at both maps together, we've just got higher fiber, lower energy alfalfa, which kind of just equals low quality forage overall. And I also wanted to add, when you think about the percentage of yield that first cutting can represent for total season yield, that's a pretty significant number. It's 50–60% at some cases. And then considering the lower quality forage that we put up in that first cutting, just kind of makes you realize how much low quality forage we might be sitting on as a result of that first half of the growing season. With that said, I don't want to be so negative because opportunities do exist for using that low quality forage. Peter Robinson with UC Davis actually has a column in our upcoming issue of Hay and Forage Grower magazine, kind of discussing those opportunities. And he had to say that although high fiber alfalfa, high NDF alfalfa is going to come with lower energy levels, that high fiber kind of creates a higher buffering capacity when cows are chewing and salivating and ruminating on that forage. So it kind of creates an opportunity to replace some high fiber straw in the ration with higher fiber alfalfa. And that high buffering capacity kind of gives a little bit more wiggle room if we want to add some more starch or supplemental energy into the ration. And there's not as high of a risk of acidosis because of that buffering capacity. So again, I'm by no means a nutritionist, but this is just some of the information I've gleaned from other experts on the matter. So if you're dealing with a lot of low quality alfalfa, I wouldn't fret because there's ways to use it for your lactating cows. But I guess I'll stop there with recommendations before I get too far into the weeds. But
Amber, we have 1 minute.
okay. With talking about forage quality, I just wanted to touch on markets here. We're kind of sitting in a 5-year low when it comes to average alfalfa hay prices. These numbers are from September. It's an average of $172 per ton, and that's a weighted average across all hay quality. But as you can see, it's pretty low relative to the historic highs we saw last year, 2022, and even back in 2021. With that said, the average price for supreme and premium quality alfalfa hay is also sitting pretty low at about $227 per ton. I just wanted to add that this is the number that is used in the dairy margin coverage program to determine the dairy margin coverage numbers. But with that said, dairy margins are at a historic high right now, so maybe these hay prices are beneficial for that aspect of things. But with that said, I guess I'll wrap up here and hand the baton off to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Amber. We appreciate that. Our next speaker, if you want to go ahead and, okay, you've done that. Deb, if you want to go ahead and put your slide set up on the shared screen. Deb Samak is a supervisory research geneticist with USDA, and she focuses on diseases and pathogens of alfalfa. So we appreciate that you're going to bring a little different look to the program this evening.
Great. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this webinar. And I'll go ahead and get started. So as Fred mentioned, I am a research plant pathologist with USDA, the Agricultural Research Service, which is the in-house part, research part of USDA. And I'm located in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm a UW-Madison graduate, and I've had over 30 years now of experience with working on alfalfa and alfalfa diseases. I collaborate a lot with different genetic suppliers of alfalfa seed, as well as extension in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And right now I'm primarily focusing on disease called Aphanomyces root rot, as well as on fungicide seed treatments, and disease has kind of fallen off our radar, which I'll talk a little bit about, called bacterial stem blight. So when I've talked to producers, I often ask them, what's the most important thing when you're producing alfalfa? What are the top 3 items? And the response is usually number 1, yield, number 2, yield, and number 3 is yield. And if you press them a little bit more, you say, well, yeah, forage quality is important, as well as stand persistence. And recently, my colleague Dennis Hancock at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center, he gave an hour-long presentation talking about alfalfa yield potential, and that's a primary determinant of profitability. So he agrees with the growers that, yeah, it's yield, stupid. And his bottom line was that, in general, if a farming operation can't support an average of 5 to 5.5 tons of dry matter per acre, then it's just not going to be profitable. So his bottom line is that good seed is the best investment you can make, and relative to other inputs, seed is really cheap. and that you shouldn't economize on seed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, making your seed decisions as you're thinking about your planting for the next years. So what does the seed package really give you? So in my opinion, this is the best way to combat diseases. It's the best way to increase persistence. It can help you attain the desired forage quality that you want. And it's the best way to customize the crop to your location. So you can kind of think of, you're putting together all the pieces of your forage program. You're getting your field prepped, you're getting your weeds controlled, getting everything ready to go. So you're going to have a fine-tuned race car with all of the pieces there. But if you don't put in high octane gas, if you're putting in low octane gas, you're putting in low quality seed, that car is never going to reach its full potential. That alfalfa field's never going to reach its full potential. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how yield can start at establishment, talk a little bit about seed rot and damping off diseases and how seed treatments are really important. Then get into a little bit more detail on Aphanomyces root rot. Finally, talk a little bit about another disease of cold soil called brown root rot, and then this bacterial stem blight disease. So we've often had, lots of tips for alfalfa establishment. I'll focus a little bit more on selecting sites with good drainage, selecting alfalfa cultivars, about planting time, and recognizing disease problems. So alfalfa growers have probably heard for hundreds of years that alfalfa does not like wet feet. And so what does that really mean? Why is that? So one of the issues about wet soil is it really favors these pathogens that we call the oomycetes or the water molds. And they are lovers of wet soil. And so these are fungus-like organisms. They have this fungal-like mycelium, but they then have swimming spores called zoospores that are released when the soil gets very wet and swim rapidly to roots of plants and infect them very quickly. And so Pythium and Phytophthora and Aphanomyces are all part of this oomycetes and this wet soil syndrome. So here's an example of some field soil on the right and a control soil that's been autoclaved so it doesn't have pathogens. And you can see that the alfalfa seedlings are coming up very well in this control soil, but there's very few seeds that have germinated in the field soil, and the few that have come up have really just toppled over, called damped off, and are dying. And if you pull these up, you can see that the roots have been rotted off from these pathogens. And if the plants do continue to grow, these roots are really compromised and they'll never form that really nice, good taproot that you need for accumulating carbohydrates that help the plants regrow and help them survive the winter. So the main way to combat these seed rot and damping off diseases, first is by management. And we often really want to get into the field as early as possible, get the seed in, get off to other projects, but it's really important not to push that planting window. So here in southern Minnesota, we really look at, this mid-April to mid-May window. Down in Iowa, you can do a little bit earlier, but you're really looking for soils that are at least 50 degrees or above before planting to try to minimize these damping off problems. And the other tool you can use, and most of the seed that we get these days, is treated with fungicides. And here I'm showing a little bit of data where we had seeds that were inoculated with this Pythium. We had very poor germination without any seed treatment. But when we treated the seed with apron or metalaxyl, we could increase germination quite a bit, although it's never 100%. Always the pathogen can always overcome these fungicides. Part of that is because the alfalfa seed is pretty small, and it's hard to put a lot of the active ingredient on an alfalfa seed. So Apron XL or Apron will protect against Phytophthora and some Pythium
that's
damping
nice.
off. And you can also get
Yep.
protection from Aphanomyces with stamina. But this treatment really lasts only about 30 days, while the diseases are really perennial. And you've also got to watch out for people trying to put too many active ingredients on a small alfalfa seed. So our best remedy, our best tool for these damping off diseases is genetic resistance, because it'll give you lifelong management of the diseases. So how do you do that? The tool that you have are these ratings of alfalfa diseases that you can get in this nice publication put out by National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance. It comes in the Hay and Forage Grower magazine, I think in the November issue. And you can also download it from the NAFA website. And it lists all the different alfalfa cultivars and their characteristics. So here's one page from the fall dormancy 4 page, and you can see all the different varieties listed, the marketers, and then winter survival scores, and then all of the scores for different diseases, as well as insect pests. And so you'll see a lot of HRs, which means that that seed has high resistance to that particular disease. Now that means that it guarantees that at least 50% of the plants have resistance to that disease. And it's really hard due to alfalfa genetics to get to 100%. But the HR means at least half those seeds in the bag have resistance to that disease. And in the Midwest, what you really want to pay attention to is the Aphanomyces race 1 and race 2. Trying to select for cultivars that have an HR for both race 1 and race 2. So, and also, it's really important to recognize, which diseases you have and which pests you have in your area. So for example, stem nematode is really important in the West, but we don't have this pest here in the Midwest. So you really want to be focusing on just the pests and pathogens that are in your location. The other tool that's really helpful, it's been developed more recently, is this Crop Protection Network website. And it lists all the different pests and pathogens of corn, soybean, wheat, and alfalfa. Was added most recently. So you can go to this Crop Protection Network, click on the encyclopedia section, and that'll take you to articles on all the different insect pests and diseases of alfalfa. And when you click on one of these diseases, it'll give you, so here's the one for Aphanomyces. It'll give you more information about the disease, lots of pictures, and for a number of them, you can see the life cycle of the disease and find out where it overwinters, what conditions lead to diseases, and then how the disease progresses over the season. So Aphanomyces attacks lots of different legumes. It's a particularly bad problem in canning peas, but also in alfalfa. The spores do persist in the soil for many years. And as I said, it's really favored by those wet soil conditions because of those motile spores. And alfalfa is pretty unique in that it has multiple races for this pathogen. So here's some of the symptoms to look for. The typical symptoms of the seedlings are that the plants germinate and they come up, but then they die off and the dead plants will lay on the surface of the soil for quite a while before they disintegrate. This is also a disease of adult plants. If you have wet soil conditions during the year. Often in the fall of the year, I'll get calls from people who have stunted and yellow alfalfa. And it's because of the Aphanomyces has chewed off all of the lateral and fibrous roots that contain the nodules. So these plants are not fixing any nitrogen, so they turn yellow and they're very stunted. And you can see that the varieties really do vary quite a bit in the amount of resistance to this disease. And that if you have very little resistance and a lot of disease in your field, have very poor establishment. So the means of managing this pathogen are to select cultivars with resistance to both race 1 and race 2. Again, try to manage the soil moisture and maintain high soil fertility. The stamina seed treatment will provide protection for about 30 days to what you can get from a resistant cultivar. But of course, the resistant cultivar gives you the resistance throughout the life of the plant. Now, if you go ahead and get a really good cultivar with Phanomyces resistance, but still have poor stand establishment, don't blame the Aphanomyces all the time. This could be due to having a lot of Pythium and other seed rot and damping off pathogens in that certain location. What you can do is send us a soil sample through the University of Minnesota Plant Disease Clinic, and we can let you know if there's Pythium or Aphanomyces present. So another disease that we see in the upper Midwest that's fairly widespread is this brown root rot of alfalfa. And so this is a disease that shows up in older stands, so usually in 2 or 3 year old fields, in which you can have roots that have different amounts of rot. Again, this is a disease that rots off the fibrous and lateral roots. It's characterized by having some of these really dark circular lesions that have a dark border. And at times you can get the lesions to grow together so that the end of the taproot is rotted off. And once that happens, then other bacteria come in and start rotting off and causing a soft rot. Again, we do have a laboratory test for detecting this pathogen for people who want to make sure of the diagnosis, because sometimes those root rots tend to look alike. And again, you can have these secondary invaders coming in and confusing the issue. A number of years ago, we helped with a survey of looking for this brown root rot and found that it is most in these northern tier states. Probably is here in North Dakota, although we didn't have any samples, and we only had a couple samples from Iowa. In these more southern states, Colorado and New Mexico, the disease is found in the high mountain valleys where it is a lot colder. And so we did quite a bit of sampling and surveying in Minnesota and Wisconsin. We had multiple samples from each of these counties in green. And what we found was that they're really kind of hot spots for brown root rot. So there's quite a few positive samples here in west of Green Bay, in the St. Croix River Valley of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and then up in the Red River Valley as well. And the interesting thing in the Red River Valley is this disease also was found on winter wheat. So it's a disease that can attack lots of different overwintering crops. So we did find a number of cultivars that had some resistance to brown root rot, although many of those now have gone off the market. So the best way to combat brown root rot currently is to select for cultivars that have really good winter persistence, winter survival scores. and also rotating into spring sown small grains. So if you're looking at your roots, sometimes you will see these white fluffy spots on the roots. And this is not a disease. It's actually a good thing. And these are called root lenticels. And what they do is they function as a way for the plant to accumulate or get gas exchange, especially in wet and heavy soils. And so this is not something to be worried about, but something that you will see often in the spring or fall of the year.
Deb, we've got 1 minute.
Okay, I am finishing up. This is a disease of the foliage called bacterial stem blight. It was first discovered in the 1900s and kind of fell off our radar screen, but we're finding it almost everywhere we look for it now. Tends to be associated with frost damage in the early spring. Can kind of see a progression here from yellowing to loss of leaves. And this is associated with a bacterium that comes in from rain and snowfall. After a late spring frost, you can get some of these symptoms. And what's most concerning to us is that we're beginning to find out that it is not just a foliar disease, but it can attack the crown buds and also cause destructive root rot. So this is now being worked on for resistance breeding. And I just want to reiterate that, for setting up for success, you want to plan for herbicide carryover, select cultivars with that HR resistance to Phantomyces, and examine your plants for abnormalities. If you find something of concern, please consult a plant pathologist, go to that crop protection network, and also utilize your plant disease clinics. So thanks very much, and I'll look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Deb. We appreciate it. Our next presenter is Scott Newell. While I'm making the introduction, Scott, there you go. Get set up. He is the alfalfa outreach specialist with UW-Madison Extension, and he's going to discuss the potential effects of the 2024 weather conditions on the 2025 alfalfa production. Scott, the podium's yours.
All right. Thanks, Fred. You can hear me just fine?
Perfect.
All right. Awesome. So, yeah, as Fred mentioned, I'm Scott Newell. I'm the alfalfa outreach specialist at the University of Wisconsin, based in Madison. This is actually a national scoped alfalfa extension position. It's 100% extension and 100% alfalfa that's provided by some USDA pass-through funding. So kind of an interesting position to support alfalfa across the nation. And anyway, was invited here to give some of my perspective on sort of what the outlook is for next season for alfalfa and maybe pontificate a little bit on what we might be seeing. So because, with alfalfa being a perennial crop, I think we always kind of need to look back before we need to look forward. So I think this has been covered a little bit by Amber's talk, but what did I see this year? Obviously, so this is we had a wet spring this year. So sorry, I'm trying to click away something on my screen and it just clicked through to the next slide. This here is rainfall that was accumulated for the upper Midwest in the early spring. You can see in quite a few regions we're well above the mean. And if we go just a little bit further here, this is right about harvest time in a lot of these different places. And of course, still getting quite a lot more rain than the average. So as I'm sure many of you who experienced this spring saw, we had a lot of growers who ended up with pretty delayed first harvest because of wet conditions, lower than desired quality, but maybe higher yield on the first cutting because of that delayed timing, and then just kind of a little bit of a catch-up factor the next few cuttings to make up for some of that quality. But really a very wet spring, obviously, as many of us experienced. And this was one of the results of that wet spring, is we had harvest happening with water in the field, waterlogged soils. Basically everywhere that I drove this spring and early summer, I could see alfalfa fields that had ruts in them. So this is in Winnebago County. This here is in southern Minnesota. And another one here where you can see some really severe damage from mostly semi trucks and road style vehicles going through these fields. Those are generally what's causing the most damage, but the ag equipment, especially in these very wet conditions, can cause damage as well. So this, of course, this damage is going to be a potential concern next year in these fields. And so something that we'll talk about in a minute here. Another thing that we saw from the wet conditions this spring was trouble with establishing some new fields of alfalfa in those wetter areas. We had a lot of seedling diseases in that early time frame, and it was a little bit difficult to establish fields, especially as we had some of those seedling diseases coming up later than we would normally expect them due to those wetter than usual conditions. So another thing that might affect us going into next year. So just to kind of bring up now looking forward to the future. So that's what I saw this year in the areas that I visited. So you've obviously probably seen this before of what's the seasonal outlook for the next few months. So generally speaking, we're a little below average on temperature in the areas that we're talking about here today, and kind of generally speaking, pretty normal on precipitation outlook. I would say versus previous years, this is a pretty good thing for the alfalfa crop. We generally don't want to have those temperatures creeping up higher during the winter time period where we get these false spring events. You can start to get green up. Then if we have another deep freeze, you've killed off some of the crown buds that would go into providing yield and regrowth the following spring. We also don't particularly want a whole lot of water over the winter. So having a fairly average seasonal precipitation is also an encouraging factor for alfalfa winter survival. So those are both, I would say, generally speaking, good things from the seasonal outlook. And I think it's interesting as well to kind of look at, well, how well do these seasonal outlooks even pan out? So just to cast you back a little bit, here's what the seasonal outlook was for the winter of 2024. And I would say based on everything that we experienced, this held pretty true. We had definitely an above average temperature winter. Last winter, we had lower than usual precipitation. For my part, being in Wisconsin, we were really in that below average precipitation. But I know that definitely occurred in Minnesota as well, with just not a whole lot of snow cover. But really that higher than average temperature was a worrying factor when we were having spring green up occurring multiple times this past winter. That was a worry, and I think for the most part people escaped that, but it's always good when you don't have to worry about those false springs in the winter, because every time that happens, your heart stops a little bit that something could, you might have some ice sheeting that occurs after that or a heaving event. So it's always good if we just can kind of stay below freezing. Again, we'll go back one more year here, and winter of 2023, I would say, in the experience that I had, this held pretty true as well. So now going back to the 2025 outlook, I guess really the main takeaway here for myself is we shouldn't expect to see any major winter kill events based on the outlook that we've got here, but with below average temperatures, normal precipitation. As long as we get a little bit of snow cover before we get into those really cold territories, that alfalfa should do fine. And of course, I think most of our acreage is going to be bolstered quite well by the long fall that a lot of us had as well. So for many areas, first frost came later than usual, which means that alfalfa had more time when it was actively regrowing, putting reserves into the roots. That all is going to help it get through the winter better. So I think, from a winter kill and winter survival perspective, things are looking pretty good for alfalfa. But again, I kind of want to instead of pontificating with no real evidence on what we might expect for next year, I think it's good to look back at prior events. So this year was definitely an anomalously wet year. So what's happened in other years where we've had anomalous weather? Well, this is data from the Wisconsin Alfalfa Yield and Persistence Trial. This is a trial that's been running for over 17 years in the state of Wisconsin. We enroll fields into the study. These are whole fields where every single load out of that field, whether it's a forage wagon or hay bales, every single load goes over a scale. So this is field scale yield data from Wisconsin, and gives us a kind of a good snapshot of what alfalfa yield looks like year to year. And you can see I've picked out 3 years here, the only 3 years in this data set where the average of all the fields in the study were below 4 tons an acre of average dry matter yield. And if you looked at those 4 years or those 3 years individually, you might say, well, there's nothing too remarkable about that. But again, thinking of alfalfa as a perennial crop, the previous year can affect the following year. And if we look at each of those 3 years where we have low yield, the prior year is a fairly anomalous weather year. 2008 was a very, very wet year. 2012 happened to be a very dry year. And 2019, as one of my colleagues has described, was one of the worst years for farming that he'd ever seen. So you can see that when we have these anomalous weather events, this either stress one way or the other to alfalfa, but especially I think from wet years and damage from rutting fields, as well as, so in this data set, they never include first year or newly seeded stands. They always include the first full year of production. So part of these lower production values could be due to poor seedling establishment, something that we did see this year as well. So I don't think it would be unreasonable to say that you might want to be bracing yourself for lower than usual forage yields because of potential damage to those stands from the early wet spring that we had, rutting up those fields, poor establishment in seedling fields. So, just kind of casting back, looking at what's happened in the past, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a little bit of that again here. So just to kind of wrap some of these thoughts together, what lies ahead. So I would expect that we'll have low stores of high quality hay coming out of this winter. We did, according to the USDA NASS crop production report, across the US, there was about an 8% increase in alfalfa forage yield this year versus last year. But of course, that report doesn't take into account anything to do with forage quality. And we did get quite a lot of good alfalfa yield in our first cutting this year, but it was generally quite low quality for a lot of folks. So while forage stores might still be relatively high or higher than normal coming out of the winter, I think we are going to see that the high quality forages have already been used up. So there may be a bit more demand for that coming out of the winter into the early spring. In my opinion, extreme winter kill events seem unlikely based on these predictions that we're getting for climate patterns. And alfalfa definitely will have benefited from that long fall. You do have, the possibility of reduced yields due to damage sustained through those wet weather harvest events. And heavily impacted fields, which can't be rotated, would be good candidates for overseeding with the grass. So of course, if you're running an operation and a lot of your fields withstood damage, you can't necessarily rotate all of those fields out and still have your operation run successfully. You have forage needs for various parts of the ration, and so having that mix on your farm is still necessary. You can't just rotate all of those heavily impacted fields out. So overseeding grasses can be a good way to help boost some of the forage yield that you get from that. So in the case of interseeding cool season annual grasses, these would be seeded in the early spring as soon as the soils are dry enough to do so, basically. But there's another option here that I think could be really interesting for folks to think about and maybe plan for going into next year in fields that did see a lot of damage, and that's interseeding or basically no-till seeding these warm season annual grasses into these damaged alfalfa stands. And the advantage of doing this, as far as I see from a quality management standpoint, is if you're planting some of these warm season grasses, as you probably know, they need warm soil temperatures anyways. Those usually come sometime right around after the first cutting of alfalfa has taken place. And you're if you've ever kept track of the number of loads that come off of your fields, or like from this Wisconsin yield data set that we have, we see that between 40 and 50% of the yield in an alfalfa stand comes off in that first cutting in a 3 or 4 cut system. So if you're taking that first cutting, you're getting a high quality alfalfa product off of that, and then seeding in one of these warm season annuals in there, and you can get a couple of subsequent harvests off of that, and it gives you a pretty significant boost in total forage biomass, even though it's not necessarily high quality. And then the last point here is to be adaptable, because I think if there's anything the last 2 years have shown me is there's really no such thing as a normal Midwest growing season. And so we have to be adaptable and know why we're making decisions on management and how to adapt those plans based on current conditions. And so I just wanted to, with the time that I have remaining here, I wanted to bring up a tool that we created here at the University of Wisconsin that could help you be adaptable to those changes in current conditions. And this tool is based around using growing degree days for alfalfa management. You might have heard of some of this before. There's kind of 2 time periods where you can use growing degree days for fall management. That would be in the fall cutting, in that last cut, or in spring management. I'll cover mostly spring management and talk mostly from a spring management perspective here because of the time that I've got left. So in the spring, you're generally looking at, in the spring, growing degree days and NDF are relatively highly correlated. So if you're looking for dairy quality feed, that 38 to 40% NDF is a pretty good target for a high quality as-fed dairy alfalfa. That would be around that 680 to 750 growing degree days accumulated since the last frost in the spring. Or if you're looking for more beef quality forage, that 950 growing degree days coincides pretty well with 45% NDF. Both of these maybe shouldn't be taken as exactly gospel, but they can be used to aid in the timing of scissor cut samples for the lab if you were in a dairy system and really needed to nail your quality. They might at least help you figure out the best times to go out and do that so that you're not taking unnecessary samples, or maybe not getting caught out from a very early spring and early regrowth happening. And so in order to help implement this, we created a tool here at the University of Wisconsin. We call it the alfalfa cutting tool. And it's a web page that I have linked at the end of the slides here, and I will also post in the chat when I'm done. And when you get there, this is the first page that you see. As you can see, we cover a large portion of the Midwest. We do cover this I-29 corridor. Unfortunately, our data set doesn't cover much further than the very eastern parts of North and South Dakota. But we do cover Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin pretty well here, as well as Michigan. And basically, we've got you come in here and you choose your location on the map, and we use current and past data on growing degree days in that specific location to create tailored charts for you to help make management decisions. So we have a few different tools in here, but the 2 I'm going to highlight are this growth projection tab up at the top, and also we have a full season planning tab up at the top. And so I just want to highlight those real quick. This is an example of what you would get out of that growth projection tool. Basically, what I've done is I went into that tab, I picked a location on the map, and then I picked a cutting date. So this was an example more for the fall cutting management, but very similar would apply in the spring. And so basically what this is doing is showing you the green line here is the accumulated growing degree days. So you can see days since the last cut, we have this green line is going up. In this case, because this is again for fall cutting management, we have this purple line here, which you wouldn't see in the spring, which is the probability of a winter or a killing frost event happening on or before that date. And the thing I want to highlight on this growth projection tool is that these data update in real time. So sorry, going back real quick, this was a chart that I pulled on September 25th. And so everything before this September 25th, this is real data. Everything after it is an average of the last 10 years. But when I pulled that more recently, you can see that line's no longer smooth. The reason for that is that we are pulling from real data. And so if you were looking at this in the spring and trying to time your first cutting, you would be seeing the actual number of growing degree days that have accumulated up to that point, and then a projection of when you would get to the growing degree day target that you're looking for. So that can help you time some of your management decisions there. Last tool I want to highlight in this is the season planning tool. This, I think, is particularly useful when we have years where weird things happen. So here I've modeled a sort of an example from last year. So because we had this really late first cut date, most of us aren't used to that. And, how do you react to that? How do you make sure that the rest of your cutting schedule is still on track and that you're not going to put yourself in a negative position for your fall management of that stand? So this is kind of an example where that first cutting was really, really late for the area, June 12th. Well above that, even the 950 growing degree days for that 45% NDF. And so we had to squeeze these other cuttings a little sooner, be more aggressive with our cutting schedule. But the main takeaway from this is being able to kind of look forward and project, if I change my management strategy, am I going to end up in a rock and a hard place come the fall, so that I'm either stuck not being able to harvest when I want to, or I'm harvesting at a time that I probably shouldn't from an alfalfa persistence perspective. So this is one to help you be a little bit more adaptable in changeable conditions. And I hope that you would find this helpful in your coming growing season. And with that, I am done here. It sounds like we'll move on to the next talk, and there will be time for questions later. But like I said, I will post this link in the chat for people, and you can find that tool online.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank
Newell.
you.
Our next presenter, if Dr. Thomas, if you'll go ahead and share your screen. I have followed Dr. Thomas for information on how we use grass in a dairy forage program, and I'm very excited to have him be part of our presenters. He's going to be talking about the weather influence on alfalfa grass seeding rates and on yield and quality of forage grasses. Dr. Thomas, podium's yours.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to provide a perspective on grass management in the northeastern United States, which is where I've spent my entire career, specifically northern New York. But certainly, I think a lot of the basics would apply to a lot of different situations. First, I'd like to talk about grass fertilization. And when you're managing grasses, a regular application of manure in a lot of cases is going to supply enough phosphorus and potassium that you're not going to need to apply commercial fertilizer other than nitrogen. And in the 30 years that I managed the crop enterprise at Minor Institute in far northeastern New York, we never applied commercial P or K fertilizer to our grassland. Manure always supplied enough fertilizer, and our soil test levels remained adequate. For about the first 15 years, we applied only nitrogen. And the second 15 years, as we started to get into some sulfur challenges, we would apply a combination of nitrogen and sulfur, supplying somewhere around 30 pounds of sulfur per year, which seemed to do a good job. As far as nitrogen rate, I think we need to rely on either your land-grant university agronomists or your crops consultants for nitrogen application rates, because there's a lot of things that go into determining the correct application rate: soil organic matter, past manure practices, the type of grass you're growing, etc. But I will tell you that nitrogen is a key. it increases both the yield and the crude protein content. How much? Some research that we did at Miner Institute on several different forage grasses found that 100 pounds of nitrogen applied at green up doubled the first cut grass yield and increased the crude protein from 12 to 18%. And so the economics of the whole grass enterprise, if you will, depends on getting enough nitrogen on at the right time. As far as second cut grass, you can either top dress that with manure, and I think on a lot of livestock farms, that's an ideal time to get the manure out. In a lot of cases, the manure pit is getting a little bit full, and it's a good time and a good place to get it out. You will not do nearly as much cutting up of the land at that time of year as you would by trying to get a lot of manure out early. Or if you decide you're going to use commercial nitrogen, as a ballpark, I'd say use about a third as much nitrogen as you did for first cut. As far as harvest management, it just ain't rocket science. That doesn't mean that it's not critically important. You need to mow your first cut in the boot stage prior to heading. And we like to see when you see the head, the quality is dead, at least for lactating dairy cow forage. Certainly, later cut grasses can be used on a dairy farm to advantage. There are times that you miss that first cut. There's just too much other things to do, or weather gets in the way and it heads out. That can be fed to some advantage to various groups of heifers, especially along with something like corn silage. But I would note that when you're seeding grasses, you need to plant one grass species in the field and only one variety of that grass species. Pure stands, no blends. And that is because both the different species and varieties within the species may head out at a different date. We have seen sometimes when there's a 2-week difference in heading date within a species, depending on if you use a very early or a very late maturing variety. So if you're going to be planting grasses, go with one species, one variety in a field. But those two things, harvest management and nitrogen, are the real keys to grass profitability. There's other factors, but both of these are absolutely critical. For second and later cuts, I tell farmers, mow it when there's enough forage that the farmer thinks he can justify harvest. And that will depend a little bit on the year, the other things that are happening on the farm, how badly he needs the second cut. And the harvest decision is pretty much in the eye of the beholder. There certainly is an unscientific way to look at it, but I think that it's a way that a lot of farmers have found is a convenient way for them to manage the crop. For weather impacts on grass management, cool and moist conditions will give you high first cut yields. This is not any surprise to farmers that have been doing this any time at all. And grass species and variety selection will both affect yield and forage quality. And over the years, we have seen grass species come and go. 20 and 30 years ago, there was a lot of interest, for instance, in reed canary grass, as some of the low alkaloid varieties of reed canary grass, Palatine, Venture, et cetera, came into use. And farmers actively used these, but eventually they found that there were other grass species that were resulting in higher quality forage, something that became increasingly necessary as milk production continued to increase and as farmers were more and more interested in looking at high forage, low grain rations. My preferred grass species is tetraploid meadow fescue. It's a widely adapted species that has become very popular in the northeastern United States because it has the highest forage quality of any species that we have looked at. We've looked at both diploid and tetraploid meadow fescues, but the tetraploid varieties, which are the ones, fortunately, that are much more available in the forage seed market, is the species that has been giving the best results. Now, cool stays in grass yield is affected by soil temperature, and the spring weather conditions that are poor for corn growth may be very, very good for grass. And so for farmers that are growing grasses and corn, in a lot of cases, we find that one will kind of compensate for the other. And the farmer that is complaining about the poor weather conditions for corn may be finding very, very good yields and good quality for cool season grasses. Now, how much the weather impact depends on the grass species. Both reed canary grass and tall and meadow fescue will tolerate wet conditions much better than, for instance, orchard grass. And timothy used to be a very popular species in the northeastern United States, but most progressive dairy farmers have long ago given up on timothy. Timothy just does not have the persistence through the growing season. Timothy, unlike some of the other forage grasses, will pretty much go dormant as the soil warms up, even if there is adequate moisture. And I tell people that timothy is kind of a school teacher grass. It works hard into June, and then it takes the rest of the summer off. And we still do have a lot of timothy grown in the northeastern United States, but not nearly as much of that is grown on progressive dairy farms. In a lot of cases, it's grown for the horse hay market. And in some cases, I think the timothy head is the only thing that a lot of these horse owners of backyard horses will recognize. Cool and moist are ideal, certainly not a surprise for dairy farmers. A combination of excess moisture and hot weather will reduce fiber digestibility, but I think the impact of that on a percentage basis is not as great for grass as it is, for instance, for corn harvested for silage. And so we do have the impacts on grass quality, but the impacts, unless we have extreme conditions, are not quite as severe as they are for other species. Well, I'd like to turn to another topic and talk about this for a few minutes, because it's one that is getting a lot of interest in the northeastern United States. And that is the big changes in the alfalfa grass seeding rates recommendations coming out of Cornell University. And we're finding in a little wider area is starting to adopt these seeding recommendations. The ideal alfalfa grass stand has somewhere around 1/3 grass and 2/3 alfalfa. The previously recommended seeding rates is roughly 3 pounds of alfalfa to 1 pound of grass. And we still see this in a lot of seed guides. And this usually results in too much grass. Cornell University, under the direction of Jerry Cherney, has been looking at this for quite a while now. And his recommendations are 1 to 2 pounds of grass and 12 to 14 pounds of alfalfa. Now, that is a big difference from what you see in a lot of seed guides, where we're looking at 4, 5, and 6 pounds of grass with anywhere of 10 or 12 pounds of alfalfa. And this is a big difference. And so I think it bears a little bit more looking at. This is a 30% grass, 70% stand. This is basically what it looks like when you have about 30% grass. And somewhere in that vicinity is kind of the sweet spot for an alfalfa grass seeding. But let's look at the seeds per pound. They vary so much. Both meadow and tall fescue were somewhere around 225, 250,000 seeds per pound. But look at orchard grass, over twice as many seeds per pound. Yet some of the seed guides that you see in some of the seed catalogs don't take into account these huge differences in seeds per pound. Certainly look at timothy, over 1 million seeds per pound, but I'm not going to spend much time on that because, again, farmers in the Northeast are not using, dairy farmers are not using nearly as much timothy as they did a generation or 2 generations ago. And again, look at alfalfa, somewhere around 220,000 seeds per pound. And so what this means is, as you're looking at reducing seed rate and making sure you don't have too many grass plants per acre, it's especially important that you are careful with something like orchard grass versus meadow fescue and tall fescue, because it has twice as many seeds per pound. But there's a little catch in this, and that is that the weather will very definitely impact the percentage of grass growth in the stand. Unusually cool, moist weather, somewhere about 1 month post-seeding, and you will get a higher percent of grass germinating and early growth versus normal weather. And this can result in too much grass in the stand, even at a 1 pound seeding rate. And Jerry Cherney commented a couple of years ago that with one of the seeding trials that they did, they seeded orchard grass at 1 pound an acre, and they wound up with substantially more than the 30% of grass in the stand. And in warm, dry conditions post-seeding, you'll get less grass, but it's better to have not enough grass than to too much. Now, these recommendations are based on a rather robust amount of research that has been done in New York State with both with multiple locations and also multiple years. And so the recommendation of 1 to 2 pounds seeding per acre or seed per acre with grass seed is based on the research done with meadow fescue. So we don't have a lot of data on the other species. I personally believe that the rate would be quite similar for tall fescue as it would be for meadow fescue. But I think the 1 to 2 pound recommendation with alfalfa is a solid one based on a lot of research. And fortunately, in the several years of research that was done in both central and northern New York, we did have 1 year that was warm and dry, relatively speaking, and another one that was cool and wet. And we did see more grass germinating and growing in the year that was cool and moist. But at the 1 and 2 pound seeding rates, the total percentage of grass in the stand was within, I'd say, 5% or so of that 30% that we were aiming at. And so these are considerably different seeding recommendations that we've seen in the past, but I think they bear some serious consideration, especially if you're using one of the fescues, and especially meadow fescue, which is a very high quality species, and looking at perhaps 2 pounds of seed per acre with somewhere around 12 to 14 pounds of alfalfa. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. Appreciate that. If you will drop your shared screen, and I'd ask Dr. Johnson to go ahead and share his screen. We've had a presenter from New York, and now we've got a presenter from Texas. I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Johnson when I was stationed in Central Texas, and I always say that I've worked with two of the best ag economists in this country, and I think he will share some great information as far as how we can pay for these forage facilities. Dr. Johnson, the podium's yours.
Thank you. I'm assuming my slide set is up and you can hear me.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Well, last Friday, I sat in my recliner and watched the 60th anniversary of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And so when I looked at the agenda and looked at the other speakers, it was only natural that I kind of felt like Charlie in the Box and the Island of Misfit Toys, both from my proximity geographically relative to the rest of you, as well as the fact that the majority of the hay production in my particular area of the state of Texas, which is not too far from Fort Worth, Dallas, about 75 miles south of the Oklahoma line, is primarily coastal and primarily for beef cattle. So I'm basically going to be approaching some of the things that I think, that I've learned as a 5th generation rancher and as an ag economist working with folks that also have, utilized hay in their production system. And hopefully some of those lessons, some of those things will be universal and at least relevant, even if you're, dairy more than beef and alfalfa more than coastal. I think there's some universal truths here with respect to economics and hay storage. So let's see. There we go. So in kind of homage to one of my mentors, one of the people that I look to for a lot of wit and wisdom is one of your neighbors there, the Oracle of Omaha, Warren Buffett. And basically, when he was talking about perfect, examples of perfect investments, he said he always looks for something that has a very high rate of return and simultaneously has an unlimited need for capital. Well, when I look at hay storage and I look at livestock industries, we can probably all agree that there's always an unlimited need for capital for those ventures. And hay storage, I think, represents a very high rate of return. The other aspect from an economic standpoint, we think about storage, is we preach diversification and we talk to different producers about adding different components to their production system to bring in new sources of revenue. And those are really marginal strategies. But really, the best investments from an economic standpoint are the things that either increase revenue or decrease costs relevant to all the units of production, not just marginal units or a fraction of the enterprise. And I think we would all agree that controlling feed costs or maintaining the superior nutritional properties or dry matter potential, those types of strategies both increase revenue from higher production, or they decrease costs by feeding higher quality forages, and the entire livestock enterprise benefits from that. So to me, as an economist, from an economics of hay storage, one of the real beauties of it is the fact that properly done, properly executed, and properly invested in is going to benefit both the revenue and the cost side of the operation. There's a lot of waste, and primarily when we go around doing hay shows, and when I do hay shows and presentations on hay, we spend a lot of our time talking about proper handling of the hay before, and the right way and the wrong way to do things. And unfortunately, as I drive down the road, I find that when I look out in the pastures, a lot of times we haven't been real effective at convincing folks of some of the better, simple ways handling hay that can, retain the nutritional properties or reduce dry matter losses. This picture here basically just shows 3 faux pas. Number one, hay sitting on the ground promotes ground wicking as moisture goes back and forth and leaches out nutrition. Putting the hay in the shade so it doesn't get rained on doesn't allow it to dry out either, and then orientation. Those hay bales, these round bales, need to be lined up end to end as opposed to where water hits one bale, rolls off, and runs right into the other one. So this is kind of the example photo I show folks of how not to do things. Contrast that with this photo, and this comes from Progressive Forage magazine back in 2018, outside hay storage recommendations, wrapping it, either net wrap or plastic wrap. The orientation you see is correct here. The space between the different long rolls of hay allows for aeration. The only thing in a slope, so the water runs off, ideally, the only thing else they could really do from an outside storage standpoint is either cover some of this with a tarp or get it off of the ground with either a hard dry pad or some other, in my case, we set our hay up on old cedar posts. Other people use tires, anything to get it off of the ground and reduce that ground working issue. So, like I said, I do a lot of hay programs for cattle producers, for livestock producers. Many of those folks produce their own hay. Some folks like me purchase hay. And when we look at it as a whole, I basically come up with, for my clientele, what I tell them is the 5 highest rate returns on investments for hay. And think back to the Warren Buffett example. We want high rates of return, but we also want unlimited uses of that capital. Well, the first one is the soil test, primarily for producers, and because the savings you can create from that are really high by not over fertilizing, and also by not under fertilizing, knowing what you're taking off of the field and replacing it. That $15-20 soil test is a very high rate of return. Unfortunately, we can't do that indefinitely. There's only so many of those that we really need. Hay testing, and this is for the folks that sell it, or hay testing for the folks that buy it, to know exactly what they're getting in terms of nutritional properties. And I tell producers, test the hay, and if it comes back really good, use that in your marketing. And if it comes back on average or really poor, then just market good hay, because that's the way that type of hay is typically sold. The next highest rate of return on investment is the PRF, or pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance. And the reason I can say that is because we know those products are subsidized to the tune of 51 to 59% subsidy. So that automatically makes those designed to pay out. And it also addresses the biggest risk that producers face, and that's lack of rainfall. Just as an example, I know y'all been putting weather pictures up all night. I have pasture and rangeland forage. In Texas last year, we got one good cutting at the first of the year. Some people got a average second cutting, and that was pretty much it. In May and June, we had about 130% of normal rainfall for that 2-month period. July and August, we received 24% of normal rainfall for that period. September and October hasn't closed yet, but we got either equal or less than that 24% during that interval. So the insurance pays people when they need it the most, when they don't get rainfall, to either, to buy additional hay, or to offset the cost of fertilizer that they don't get any benefit from because of lack of rainfall. Next is heavy, solid bottomed hay rings, to minimize losses, feeding losses. It doesn't take much to pay for those better quality hay rings that reduce loss from maybe 21-25% loss from defecation and stepping on, down to 5% loss. More expensive hay rings that are heavier can pay for themselves pretty quick. And then we get down to the last one that I basically consider somewhere between 16% rate of return on average. And sometimes it's better, and that's hay storage capacity. Putting money into a facility, whether it's a pole barn, open-ended, or a closed barn, it can, 15-16% is still quite a bit higher than what I know my bank is paying. So the reason when we talk about hay storage, we all know, and it's fairly common knowledge, it reduced the amount of dry matter losses. And this was a study done in University of Tennessee, where they baled the hay in June, they stored it in different formats, and then they took it in January and they compared just the dry matter losses. That was stored exposed on the ground lost 37% of its dry matter. If it was just raised off of the ground, that reduced the loss down by about 8%. Stored on the ground but covered, you had 29% loss. Stored off of the ground and covered, look at that reduction, 21% reduction in dry matter loss. Net wrap stored on the ground lost 19% of the dry matter, and stored in the barn 6%. When hay is really expensive, and hay is always, expensive as a purchaser, anything you can do to reduce those losses as much as possible goes into the return on your investment on those additional practices that you spend to preserve the quality, nutritional quality, or the dry matter quality. Other things we know, make a big dense bale. The bigger the bale, the less loss we tend to see from weathering and covering those things up. And there's a lot of research out there basically saying the bigger bales, if you look at a weathered layer of 2, 4, 6, or 8 inches, that's going to be wasted and not eaten. The smaller the bale, the larger their percentage of that bale suffers from weather-related deterioration. But there again, a lot of folks sell their hay based on a round bale and not on tonnage. And so the incentive is to produce as many bales as possible, not necessarily as much tonnage as possible. So we have kind of a disconnect. Purchasers need to be aware of that. We also know that the hay storage also can preserve the nutritional qualities for many years. And we know that, different categories of cattle, dairy cattle, lactating cattle have much higher nutritional demands than some of these other, late gestation cows or dry to early mid gestating cows. So the hay storage fulfills the capabilities of helping to preserve the protein content and keeping it out of the weather as well. So there's your 2 parts: dry matter loss prevention, nutritional quality preservation. And then we've talked about, this is the 3rd one, and this is one, I just put these prices up. This is Texas hay prices. The illustration I'm trying to make here is that hay prices are volatile, and it's a Murphy's Law thing. When it rains, hay prices around here locally are really cheap because everybody's got hay. When it doesn't rain, hay prices are really high because nobody has any, or we have to bring it in from other sites. In the drought of 2011 in Texas, I know I had to purchase hay all the way out from Arkansas, and I got to introduce some really new weed species to my pasture that I really didn't want to. From a hay storage standpoint, and I know this might not be completely possible for dairies that are utilizing tremendous volumes of hay, but what I tell my beef producers is build enough storage to put 2 years worth of hay demand and fill that barn up in years when we recognize hay is cheaper than it is on average. And then maybe it allows you to sidestep or avoid having to buy hay in those years when hay prices are really high. I know Amber in our presentation earlier said that alfalfa prices are at a 5-year low. Well, heck, that's when I want to fill up the barn. And the more hay storage capability that you have, the more that you can utilize, prices that extend more than one season to help manage your feed costs. And even if it's just partially allowing you to lower your feed costs by buying less in those high dollar years, to me, that benefits all your units of production and helps kind of average down or give you a little bit of cushion on your feed cost. Last thing I really got here is there's nothing new about this. I don't know what happened to Building Age magazine. Maybe it got swallowed into the Progressive Hay and Forage magazine. But if you look at this, the highlighted area I have there says, in some cases, especially during unusually wet and stormy seasons, a cheap hay barn will almost all pay for itself in 1 year in the savings of a large quantity of first-class hay. That doesn't address the quality of hay that it preserves. And it doesn't address the fact that next year may not be wet and hay may be more expensive. So helping to balance out multi-year hay opportunities. So this was one of 3. And if you look in the upper left-hand corner, this was the article published in March of 1919. So again, I don't think I'm really bringing up any issues that, any producer, whether they're dairy or beef cattle, hadn't thought of before, but hopefully kind of put it into perspective of when we look at our respective operations and we figure out where we should be investing dollars, I think hay storage has a lot of merit there to help us manage to maintain high quality hay that we have, to reduce dry matter losses, and also to hopefully be able to sidestep a portion of those years when it's drier than normal and hay prices are inordinately high. So with that, that's the bullet points. Thank you for including me in. Again, I realize I'm kind of out of sorts here, but I appreciate Fred's invitation and have enjoyed listening to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. Now we're moving into the section of the program, which I hope is super exciting for most of the folks listening in. I've got two of my folks to help with questions. Dr. Jim Sulphur from Minnesota, as well as I've got from South Dakota. We've got, boy, I'm embarrassed as can be, Sarah Bauder, who will help, as well as our forage person from Iowa State, Shelby Gruss. So if you guys have collected some questions, we can either start with those, or if the folks listening want to go ahead and unmute and just ask a question directly, we'll give you a couple of seconds to make that happen. Okay, not hearing any of them come. I've got a question for Deb. Are you seeing any emerging diseases that we haven't seen in this corridor coming in, kind of taking anybody by surprise?
Yeah, the last disease that I mentioned, bacterial stem blight, was something that was seen in really early years in like Colorado and Utah and Kansas, but really fell off the radar screen. And it has emerged first in California, but we've been seeing it now almost everywhere that we've looked for it. And I'm suspecting that it is causing a lot more damage than we had initially expected. And so this is now being recognized by the breeding companies as a new target for developing resistance. And we hopefully should be seeing some more progress on that pretty soon. Other than that, as we started looking at these root rot diseases and seedling diseases, we found that there are some pathogens that we hadn't recognized before, some different species of Phytophthora that are pathogens of soybean that may be finding a new host in alfalfa. So yes, there are some new targets for breeding and for problems for alfalfa. Yep.
Very good.
Can you hear me, Fred?
Yep, sure can.
You follow up with your question, then I've got one too.
No, go ahead, Jim.
And this could be for maybe Deb or Scott, whoever can answer it. Does it help to rotate alfalfa for diseases, or what can you do? Do these diseases stay in the soil? So they stay there. We rotate out corn 2 or 3 years. Just trying to figure out, is there kind of a natural way that we can minimize the risk of these diseases?
Yeah, where we're seeing a lot of, especially Phytophthora and Aphanomyces, is where producers are doing a really short rotation out of alfalfa, that they're only doing a year or two from corn or soybean. So, more and more years of alfalfa you tend to build up the alfalfa pathogens. So expanding the rotations, to different crops, including a small grain really helps. And, doing, having a few more years between the alfalfa crops can really help minimize some of the alfalfa diseases because the pathogens do tend to accumulate in the soil and can be pretty long-lived in the soil. And Scott, you can weigh in if you have something to add there.
Oh, I have nothing more to add other than Damon Smith at EW would agree with you. So he's our plant pathologist there.
Okay, I've got another question. This one's maybe a little bit more for Scott or someone else. What's the best way to assess your fields? I think we did a lot of talking today about the weather and maybe the damage in our fields as we went into harvest this year. And so is there a good way to assess your fields in the spring to get a feel? Do I need to be planting more alfalfa? Do I need to be purchasing alfalfa if the price is right? How would a producer start doing that? I assume you'd have to do that in the spring.
Yep. So most of that field scouting would happen in the spring. It's never a bad idea to get out and do it early, especially if you have some fields that may be more at risk to winter damage. Oftentimes when we're talking about the potential productivity of alfalfa stands, what we're talking about is seeds or stems per square foot. So that's going out, throwing a quadrat and counting stems per square foot. That actually gets kind of tricky as a metric when we're talking about these fields where we've got concentrated damage like rutting and things like that. You might have areas of the field where you're within that or above that 55 stems per square foot range where we would say you should expect maximum forage yield from this. But you might have some areas of your field where if you threw your quadrat there, it would be 5 stems per square foot because you had heavy damage. So it is a little bit more difficult in that regard. I think there could be some potential for, this isn't necessarily standard procedure, but with drone and aerial imagery being more common on farms and especially with crop consultants, there may actually be some potential to do some partitioning of, greenery versus soil to get an idea of what the kind of damaged area of the fields look like. But I think really the most important part is still going to be those stem counts. And really, I would always encourage people to be digging up plants too to assess crown health coming out of the winter. Split the crowns open, check on the root health. You'll find many places with illustrations online, but what you're looking for generally is very firm white tissue in the center of that root. If you've got really spongy and dark tissue, that's generally a sign of seedling or crown disease. Those crowns often end up uneven as well. When you dig up those crowns, you'll see that there's shoots coming out one side and not out the other. Those are going to be generally less productive as well. So that's probably the most important indicator for a season like this, where we do have this uneven stand effect, is assessing that crown health. And if the crown health is poor, that's a pretty good candidate for rotating and replacing. If the crown health is still good and you've got a few ruts in that field, the experience that I have coming from California in my graduate work, there they grow a lot of alfalfa on beds. That alfalfa is, so those beds have irrigation canals in between. Those irrigation canals are anywhere between 12 and 15 inches wide. And the production can be very similar to a solid seeded stand in those cases. So the alfalfa can canopy over gaps like that if it's healthy enough. So I think evaluating roots is going to be a really important part of evaluating stands this spring. And generally, it's a very important thing to do.
I have a quick follow-up on that. Scott, you mentioned in your presentation that there could be a lot of established, last year when you were establishing your stands, some failures occurring. As you're coming out of this spring, what would be your suggestion on potentially reseeding this year? Would you reseed with alfalfa or switch over as we're coming up on that kind of 1 year time frame? We're looking at autotoxicity. Any thoughts?
Yeah. So I think if you had, I had this question a few times in July this past year, and my answer in July was you're probably safe to reseed because you've had a failed stand. It's not a very strong stand. There hasn't been enough time for those toxins to accumulate, but now we're in that time frame where it's probably risky. And so if you have other options, I would recommend pursuing those other options. If you really had to plant alfalfa into that stand, depending on your soil type, you may not have as much of an issue, but in multiple studies that have been done on that, you can still see a 10 to 20% decrease in yield from planting in an interval like that. So probably not the best idea at this point.
I'm going to just kick this question out to whoever wants to tackle it. But right now, we've just dug our moisture profiles, and, we've got some moisture in the top foot. Down there, it's just kind of powder. Well, if we get some snow, maybe not a lot, we get some snow, we get some spring rains, does that actually catch us up? Or will we still have trouble as those roots penetrate down deeper into the profile?
Well, Deb, I know you've been doing a lot of work with root architecture as well. So if you wanted to chime in here, but I think, especially with snow cover, as that melts, as long as that melts slowly and we don't see a whole host of runoff, which can often be an issue for us coming out of the winter, then that can be a method for us to catch up on that soil moisture. But I probably wouldn't bank on snow filling up your profile. That being said, generally our springs are wetter times of year, so I would expect that we'll see that profile fill naturally as we go into spring. The question is whether it fills and we maintain some rain long enough into the summer that that profile is still full deeper in that root zone. Alfalfa will produce branch roots at the it does have a very deep crown, but it will produce a fibrous root system in that topsoil. There's a number of studies that I've seen for crown biomass or root biomass of alfalfa that puts a significant amount of that root biomass within the first 2 feet of the soil profile. So even though that taproot does go deep, there's still significant water scavenging ability from alfalfa in those top couple of feet.
I've got a follow-up, and I think Jim Paulson may have dropped off, so this maybe is just for Ev Thomas. But we've talked, or I think Scott mentioned about interseeding, potentially some grass in. Maybe you've got some areas where your stands are not very good, where you've driven a lot and the rest looks really good. Do you have recommendations of what grasses maybe sort of mature at the same time as alfalfa so we can try and maintain really good quality stands? I know Jim Paulson has looked at this, but Ev, I think you probably have a pretty good feel too, or anyone else for that matter, Scott or any of our
I would
speakers.
avoid anything except the absolute latest maturity orchard grasses that are out there. In recent years, there have been some late maturity orchard grasses out there that are reasonably okay. I like orchard grass because it's a fairly aggressive seedling, as opposed to some of the others. The absolute last one I would look at would be canary grass. It has a very weak seedling. But I guess if you're looking at something like that, especially a fairly short life of stand, since you're essentially filling in an old one, I would look at orchard grass because of the vigor of the seeding and try to choose the latest variety you can find.
Okay.
I have a question for Dr. Johnson. So you're talking about hay storage. I think there's such a important aspect to, you did all this work to create high quality hay. Let's try to keep it high quality throughout time. What's your thoughts, hay storage wise, of wrapping your bales? Are you seeing that more commonly? Is that an effective way to keep that quality dry matter losses down? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, anything net wrapping, we've seen. I've seen over the last 3 or 4 years a much increased use of complete plastic wrapping of the bowl of the bales. You know, it looks like a marshmallow farm when you drive around and see those. Anything that's going to be able to keep that from exposure is going to essentially accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. And in lieu of having an enclosed facility to be able to store that much hay in, all those practices definitely will pay for themselves in terms of reducing the both the dry matter loss as well as the nutritional loss. So, you know, there's a hierarchy there, and it's as simple as keeping those bales off of the ground all the way up to enclosed storage. And every step along the way is a very viable practice, I think, to maintain the quality of the hay. Because you're right, we spend a tremendous amount of money and resources to produce the highest quality hay as possible. Why in the heck would you want to let it just sit there and leach out? That's the greatest waste there is.
So this is a question to sort of follow up to that. And I think anybody that's on this probably has some real keys. And this is maybe more for baleage than maybe it is for hay. How do we keep the critters from making holes in that hay storage? Amber, have you had anybody write a good story on that, on how to keep, is it a good dog? Is it traps? Is it a gun? Is how do we keep critters from making holes in our hay storage? There's nothing more frustrating. Maybe you don't have those in Texas. Maybe you don't have critters like we do up here, but boy, we got them and they're everywhere.
Yeah, we call it the 3 S's: shoot, shovel, and shut up. But you know, traps certainly can help with those. You know, in any of those pest management practices. Good barn cats, good dogs, and traps probably, you know, will go a long way along those lines. But you know as well as I do that a good smart coon is awful hard to outwit.
Yeah. Amber, is any articles that you can remember? I know you haven't been there real long. That'd be a good topic, is keeping critters away from or out of forage storage, because they can do a lot of damage.
I was just about to say, I don't think we have any recent articles on that particular topic, but now you've got my my interest. I'll look into it.
I will say that if you're going to live trap coons, you want to haul them a very long way away. We had a farmer doing that, and he wasn't decreasing his population very much. And just for the heck of it, he decided to take a can of green paint. Obviously, he was a John Deere guy, and spray the butt of the coons that he was trucking away. And he started catching a couple of green butted coons and decided that he had to haul them a little further away. True story.
Jason, I've got one question. You mentioned 16 to 18% return on investment when you have these new hay facilities. What kind of floor should your new hay shed have?
Well, and again, you know, this is just kind of an estimate, and it's going to pay for itself more quickly if prices are really high from one year to the next, and you're able to save some of that from not having to buy higher quality hay. You know, in a perfect world, you'd want a concrete floor, but again, that's going to push back that payback period, because You know, when I built my barn after the drought of 2011, I spent an equal amount on the floor as I did on the rest of the whole facility. So, you know, in practicality standpoint, I think the barn's first if you can possibly afford the floor and you know you're going to be around for more than 5 or 10 years, you know, then that's an investment worth making. If you look at about a 16% rate of return, you're talking about a 6-year payback period. So if you're going to be, you know, if it's a multi-generational operation, you're probably going to, it makes sense to spend a little more and extend the useful life of that investment further. So again, you know, going back to the same question we had earlier, you spend as much as you can afford to spend on increasing your hay storage or your hay handling practices. And you know, some folks that budget's a little higher than others, but that's kind of where I stand on that.
If we use that 4-inch chat, will that prevent wicking? Will that create airspace, or do we have to use tires, or what's your thoughts on other than?
You just got to get it off the ground. That's it, you know, because you got to either get it off the ground and get it to where the weeds don't grow up, you know, 4 inches and then still allow that ground wicking to go on. So that's the objective, is to put some barrier in between grass in those hay bales. And a lot of people will just lay down some caliche, or they'll lay down some, you know, some rock, and that helps too, you know, because you're not going to have grass growing through there. So just get it off the ground or get it separated from other forages where they're going to constantly be trading moisture back and forth.
We have a minute here. Anybody want to unmute and ask a question directly? Or do we, Sarah, have you got a burning question?
You know, Jim kind of stole mine, so now I'm just listening.
I want to see that baby. That's what I want, Sarah.
I have to go acquire the child, though.
Oh, she's probably sleeping. Boy or girl? I can't remember.
Girl, Olive.
Okay.
You can tell we're kind of a close-knit group here. It's hearing no other questions. We've got about 3 minutes left, but I'm not a stickler to just keep a meeting open if we've got no questions coming. I'd like to thank our presenters. We had a very diverse group and a lot of great information that was shared in kind of a unique format, asking you to do 2, 3, 4 bullet points in 20 minutes or a couple of bullet points in 10 probably is not something you do every time you're asked to speak, but I sure appreciate you doing a fantastic job with this. Anybody want to do a closing statement? Other than Amber's going to write a story on varmints in the hay barn. Okay, very good.
Thanks for organizing this, Fred. It was very good.
Well, as I said early on, we had a great partnership with our Northern Plains Forage Association. This is the second forage program, and we'll have a couple more programs scheduled this year for it. So thank you for the kind words. I'll send that back to our boards. Well, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and close the program. Thank the presenters again for having the time to present for us, and thank the folks who attended to pick up some information. Sarah, Olive looks really good there. So, okay. Thank you now.